He was a millionaire CEO, a man who built his empire on control, numbers, and walls so high no one could climb them. She was just his secretary, quiet, dependable, carrying the weight of sacrifices no one ever saw. They were never supposed to be anything more than colleagues. But one snowstorm in the mountains of Colorado changed everything. What happens when two people, one defined by power, the other by patience, are forced to share a single cabin, with nowhere to run from the silence between them? What secrets come to light when the fire burns low and the storm rages outside? Can trust be rebuilt after betrayal? And can love bloom in a place where once there was only distance? This is not a story about fairy tale romance. It is a story about staying not just through the storm, but until it passes, about forgiveness, second chances, and the courage to open the door we once thought was safer to keep locked. If this story stirs something in you, don't forget to like this video, share it with someone who needs a little hope today, and subscribe to our channel for more heartfelt stories. Now, let's begin. Jonathan Pierce was the kind of man whose name echoed in glass towers and boardrooms across America. At 51, he had everything that the world claimed was success. He owned a home on the cliffs of Carmel, a penthouse in Manhattan, and a collection of tailored suits that seemed to carry authority in their stitching. His company, Pierce Development Group, had grown from a small real estate firm in his late 20s to a national empire worth billions. Investors trusted him. Competitors feared him. Magazines called him unshakable. But in the silence of his Denver condo, when the meetings ended and the screens went dark, Jonathan was just a man who ate dinner alone. The clink of silverware against a porcelain plate was often the only sound in the evenings. His marriage had ended nearly a decade ago, undone by long hours, missed birthdays, and the slow erosion of intimacy. The divorce settlement had been clean, almost surgical, but it left behind something heavier than financial loss, an emptiness that success could not fill. Jonathan wasn't bitter, not exactly. He had learned to carry solitude the way other men carried briefcases, firmly, efficiently, without complaint. Yet it showed in the small things, the way he avoided eye contact in elevators, the way he dismissed casual conversation, the way he turned down every invitation that wasn't directly tied to profit. To the outside world, Jonathan Pierce was in control. To himself, he was a man who had quietly stopped believing in connection. Then there was Claire Donovan. At 38, Claire had spent nearly 5 years as Jonathan's executive secretary. If anyone asked her colleagues to describe her, they might have said she was efficient, dependable, polite. What they wouldn't know was that behind her calm exterior lay a woman who had once dreamed of becoming a teacher. She had earned a scholarship to the University of Michigan, eager to major in literature and perhaps shape young minds. But life, as it often does, had other plans. Her mother died of ovarian cancer during Claire's sophomore year. Her father, a factory worker with little savings, fell into depression, barely managing to get through his shifts. Bills piled up, grocery lists shrank. Claire withdrew from school, moved back home, and quietly became the anchor that kept her family afloat. She took temporary jobs, filing clerk, receptionist, assistant, until eventually she landed a stable position at Pierce Development Group. Claire wasn't invisible, not really, but she had mastered the art of taking up little space. She anticipated Jonathan's schedule with near-psychic precision, deflected unnecessary calls, and arranged his calendar so seamlessly that he often forgot what life had been like before she worked for him. She didn't gossip in the break room or linger over lunch. She was simply present, always steady, always reliable, and yet, in her quiet way, she noticed things like how Jonathan rubbed his temple when negotiations grew tense, or how his voice lowered almost imperceptibly when he was tired. If Jonathan lived behind walls, Claire was one of the few who had ever stood close enough to see the cracks. She never mentioned them. She never tried to cross the line between boss and assistant. But she saw, that December, the annual Mountain Real Estate Leadership Summit was scheduled at Alpine Ridge, a secluded resort high in the Colorado Rockies. Normally, Jonathan would have sent a vice president in his place, but this year was different. A land acquisition project that could redefine the company's trajectory was on the agenda. It was sensitive, confidential, and too important to delegate. He told himself he needed Claire there to handle logistics, to keep him buffered from the endless cocktail hours and networking games. The truth, though he wouldn't have admitted it, was that Jonathan had grown used to her presence. In her steady silence, he found something that felt almost like peace. The drive up the mountain started under clear skies. Jonathan's black Range Rover handled the icy curves with ease, and the hum of the engine filled the comfortable quiet between them. Claire, as usual, was poised, her notebook balanced on her lap, pen tucked neatly behind her ear. She read through the agenda without being asked, occasionally making notes in her tidy handwriting. Snow began falling around noon, light at first, dusting the windshield like powdered sugar. Jonathan didn't comment. He rarely did. Claire glanced at the sky, at the thickening clouds, and thought of the forecast she'd read that morning. A winter storm advisory had been posted, but the resort staff had assured her the roads were still passable. She didn't mention it. Jonathan disliked unnecessary chatter. By the time they passed the last gas station before the mountain road narrowed, the snowfall had thickened into heavy flakes, spinning wildly in the wind. The temperature dropped, the world outside the car growing steadily whiter, quieter, more treacherous. Jonathan adjusted his grip on the wheel, jaw set. Claire watched the storm gather like a curtain closing around them. It was supposed to be a routine business trip. 2 days of meetings, a handful of negotiations, and then back to Denver in time for Jonathan's next round of investor calls. But storms have a way of rewriting even the most carefully laid plans. Neither of them knew it yet, but the blizzard sweeping down the slopes of the Rockies would change more than their itinerary. It would change them, because sometimes life doesn't ask politely before it upends everything you think you know. Sometimes it arrives uninvited, loud, cold, unrelenting, and locks two people in the same space with nowhere to hide. Jonathan Pierce was a millionaire CEO. Claire Donovan was his secretary. And that night, in a cabin buried by snow, everything they thought they understood about themselves and about each other was about to be tested. But one snowstorm changed everything. By the time Jonathan and Claire reached the outskirts of Alpine Ridge, the snow had thickened into a steady curtain. The Range Rover's headlights carved narrow tunnels through the white, and the wipers worked in steady rhythm against the windshield. The higher they climbed, the sharper the air became, thin, crisp, filled with the metallic tang of oncoming winter. Claire sat quietly, her hands folded over her notebook, though she had stopped writing long ago. Instead, her gaze lingered on the pines lining the roadside, their branches sagging beneath new snow. She had always found something soothing in the mountains, as if the silence carried its own kind of wisdom. Tonight, though, the beauty came wrapped in unease. The storm was no longer a passing inconvenience. It was settling in for the night. Jonathan's jaw remained tight, his eyes fixed on the winding road. He didn't comment on the weather, didn't voice concern, though Claire noticed the way his fingers pressed harder against the steering wheel. Silence, for him, was a shield. But Claire had learned long ago to read what he didn't say. After another hour, the car finally curved around a bend that opened to a clearing. There, perched against the backdrop of the Rockies, the resort came into view. Even through the storm, it was striking a lodge built from stone and timber, its tall windows glowing gold against the snowy dusk. Smoke curled from the chimneys, and the faint sound of bells chimed from somewhere deep inside, muffled by distance and falling snow. Jonathan exhaled once, a quiet sound of relief. Claire allowed herself a small smile. Safe, at least for now. Inside the lodge, warmth greeted them instantly. The scent of pine wood and cinnamon drifted through the lobby, carried on heat from a massive stone fireplace that roared at the center. A Christmas tree towering, decorated with glass ornaments that caught the light, stood near the reception desk. Guests milled about with mugs of cider, scarves draped loosely around their necks, their laughter muffled but cheerful. For a moment, Claire let the glow seep into her. She imagined what it might be like to arrive here not as an assistant, but as a guest, free to settle by the fire with a book and a cup of tea. The thought passed quickly. She followed Jonathan to the desk, her heels clicking softly against the polished wood floor. The young man behind the counter straightened nervously as Jonathan approached. His name tag read Evan. His smile was polite but strained, the kind of expression that tried to hide bad news. "Good evening, Mr. Pierce. Welcome to Alpine Ridge." His fingers moved quickly across the keyboard. "We've been expecting you." Jonathan gave a short nod. "Reservation under Pierce Development Group, Executive Suite." Evan's smile faltered. "Yes, sir. About that." He cleared his throat, lowering his voice. "We've had some complications with the storm. The booking system glitched during the outage earlier today, and, unfortunately, your suite was double assigned." Jonathan's brow furrowed. His presence alone seemed to make the desk clerk shrink. "Meaning," Evan swallowed, "meaning we're overbooked. We've moved quickly to accommodate everyone, but the only space we have left is one of our cabins." He hesitated. "Cabin 7? It's fully stocked and premium grade, fireplace, kitchen, mountain view, but..." His voice trailed off. But what Jonathan's tone was calm, but edged in steel. "It's only got one bedroom." Silence stretched, heavy and uncomfortable. Claire looked up from her phone, her expression unreadable, though inside she felt her stomach tighten. Jonathan's gaze shifted briefly toward her before returning to the clerk. "One bedroom," he repeated flatly. "Yes, sir. There is a loft area, but it isn't heated. Normally we would never..." Jonathan raised a hand, cutting off the apology. He pressed his thumb and forefinger to his temple, a gesture Claire had seen 100 times in meetings. He was measuring his response, weighing irritation against practicality. Outside, the storm continued to howl against the glass windows, as though reminding them both there were no other options. Claire's voice, when it came, was quiet and steady. "We don't have much of a choice." Jonathan's eyes flickered toward her again. He found no panic there, no complaint, just the calm acceptance she always carried like an invisible shield. For reasons he didn't want to name, it unsettled him more than the storm. Evan slid 2 keys across the counter, his hand trembling just slightly. "We've stocked the cabin with firewood and blankets. If you need anything at all, please call the front desk." Assuming the lines hold, Jonathan picked up the keys, his jaw tight, his expression unreadable. He turned without another word, and Claire followed him back through the lobby, past the fire, past the tree, past the warmth of the crowd. The snow outside was fiercer now, driving sideways across the parking lot. Their boots crunched over the frozen gravel as they walked toward Cabin 7, its roof heavy with fresh snow, its chimney trailing a thin stream of smoke into the night sky. From a distance, it looked cozy, almost picturesque, a postcard image of winter in Colorado. But Jonathan felt none of the charm. What troubled him wasn't the storm. It wasn't the shortage of options. It was the woman walking just a few steps behind him. Not because he disliked her, but because he liked her more than he ever intended to. Cabin 7 stood at the edge of the resort's property, half hidden among towering pines whose branches bent low under the weight of fresh snow. From the outside, it looked like something pulled from a Christmas card, a peaked roof, soft golden light glowing from the windows, smoke drifting lazily from the chimney. But as Jonathan unlocked the door and stepped inside, he realized how deceiving appearances could be. The cabin was warm. Yes. The fireplace was already lit, the flames crackling against stone, casting a steady orange glow across the knotty pine walls. A plaid blanket hung over the back of the sofa, and a small basket of welcome supplies sat on the kitchen island: crackers, cheese, a bottle of red wine. But the space itself was close. Too close. Jonathan paused just inside the doorway, his tall frame nearly filling the entry. He set his briefcase down beside the couch, then glanced quickly around the room. It was a single open space living area, kitchen, and a queen-size bed tucked against the far wall. A narrow staircase climbed to a loft above, little more than a crawl space with a futon mattress. Cozy for a vacationing couple, problematic for two people who had spent years keeping professional distance. Claire stepped in behind him, her boots soft against the wooden floor. She pulled off her gloves, smoothing them carefully before setting them on the counter. Her eyes scanned the room briefly, taking in the same details Jonathan had, though her face betrayed nothing. "I'll take the loft," she said, her voice quiet but firm. Jonathan turned toward the staircase, then back to her. "It's not heated. I'll manage." She offered a faint, polite smile, the kind that deflected argument without inviting further discussion. He hesitated, then nodded. "Then I'll take the sofa." The decision landed between them like a contract signed in silence. Efficient, practical, emotionless. For a few minutes, they moved about the cabin in parallel, never colliding, never lingering in the same space. Jonathan shrugged off his overcoat and folded it neatly over the back of a chair. Claire unpacked a small bag, placing a book and a scarf on the kitchen counter before disappearing up the narrow staircase. The wood creaked faintly under her weight, then went still. Jonathan exhaled slowly, rubbing the back of his neck. He crossed the room, crouched near the fire, and added a log from the metal bin. Sparks leapt upward, the flames responding eagerly. Outside, the storm pressed harder against the cabin, wind howling through the trees, snow rattling against the windows like impatient fingers. Inside, the only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the steady tick of an old clock on the wall. When Claire returned, she moved quietly, carrying a folded blanket from the loft. She placed it on the sofa's armrest, then poured herself a glass of water from the pitcher in the welcome basket. Her movements were deliberate, graceful in their restraint, as if she had rehearsed how to occupy space without ever intruding. Jonathan watched from the corner of his eye, though he quickly turned back to the fire when she noticed. "Long day," she said softly, more to herself than to him. He gave a brief nod. "It'll be longer tomorrow." Silence followed, not hostile, but heavy, the kind of silence that carried all the things neither dared to say. Jonathan opened his laptop on the table near the window, its glow bright against the dim cabin. He typed quickly, fingers striking keys with mechanical precision. Claire sat on the far side of the sofa, pulling her book into her lap. She flipped pages slowly, though her eyes drifted now and then to the man across the room, the way his brow furrowed, the way he leaned back slightly when thinking, the way he seemed both present and absent all at once. Hours slipped by like this, the storm outside intensifying, the two of them orbiting each other in a room barely large enough for one orbit. Every small sound was amplified: the turn of a page, the click of a keyboard, the shift of fabric when one of them moved. It was intimacy born, not of choice, but of proximity, and it pressed against them with quiet insistence. Claire set her book aside eventually, rising to pour herself tea from the small kettle on the stove. The scent of chamomile drifted through the room. Jonathan didn't look up, but he always noticed, when she returned to her seat. Their eyes met briefly, just a flicker, not quite a conversation, not quite avoidance. And in that flicker, something unspoken lingered: curiosity, tension, maybe even recognition. The fire snapped loudly, breaking the moment. Jonathan returned to his laptop. Claire sipped her tea. The storm raged outside. It was the first night of many they would spend together in Cabin 7. The beginning of a silence that wasn't empty at all, but full of restraint, of questions, of things buried too deep to name. For now, neither spoke, but both felt it: the closeness, the distance, the quiet war of hearts too guarded to surrender. The storm did not let up. By the next morning, snow had piled against the windows of Cabin 7, muting the daylight into a soft gray haze. The world outside was silent except for the occasional groan of wind pressing against the roof. Inside, the fire had burned low during the night, leaving only faint embers that pulsed like tired hearts. Jonathan had risen early, as he always did. Routine was his armor. By 6 o'clock, he was seated at the small wooden table near the window, laptop open, the pale glow reflecting off his face. His posture was rigid, shoulders squared, jaw set. Claire descended from the loft slowly, wrapped in a wool sweater, her hair loosely tied back. She moved with quiet care, mindful of every creak in the stairs. "Morning," she said softly. Jonathan lifted his gaze briefly, offered a nod, and returned to his screen. He wasn't trying to be unkind. Words simply felt heavier than they should in moments like this. Claire busied herself with the welcome basket, slicing an apple, arranging crackers, boiling water for coffee. She had grown used to mornings of silence with Jonathan, both in the office and now here in the cabin. But silence in an office was professional. Silence in a cabin felt different, personal, weighted, unspoken. When the kettle whistled, she poured coffee into a ceramic mug and set it near Jonathan's elbow without interrupting his typing. It was a simple gesture, one she had done countless times before. She turned back to the counter, reaching for a cloth napkin, but when she returned to tidy the space, her sleeve brushed the edge of the mug. Time slowed, the cup tipped, tumbled, and fell. Hot coffee spilled across the table, seeping instantly into the stack of printed documents Jonathan had been reviewing. Ink bled into dark blurs, pages curling as liquid spread. Jonathan froze. His hands lifted from the keyboard, as if scorched by the sight. For a heartbeat, neither spoke. The only sound was the hiss of paper absorbing what could not be undone. Claire's voice caught. She grabbed a napkin, blotting desperately at the pages. "I'm so sorry. I didn't mean you were trying." His voice was quiet, measured, but cold enough to sting. That's the problem. The words landed heavier than he intended. Claire's hands stilled, napkin damp in her grasp. She blinked once, lips pressed into a line. The fire behind her had begun to crackle louder, but the room itself felt colder. "I'll go upstairs," she said finally. Her tone was calm, almost too calm, like porcelain holding back a crack. Jonathan opened his mouth, then closed it again. He could have said, "It's fine." He could have said, "It was just paper." But the words caught, barricaded by pride, by habit, by the reflex of a man who had spent too many years mistaking distance for strength. Claire turned without another glance, gathered her book from the sofa, and climbed the stairs. Her footsteps were careful, steady, but Jonathan heard the finality in each one. When the loft door closed, the cabin settled into silence so sharp it rang in his ears. Jonathan stood motionless, staring at the ruined papers. Coffee had soaked deep into the fibers, ink bleeding like bruises across once pristine pages. He pressed a hand to his temple, exhaling slowly. He wasn't angry at her. Not really. He was angry at himself, at the reflex that had turned a small accident into a wound. He wanted to go upstairs, to knock on the loft door, to tell her that he hadn't meant it, that he knew she had only been trying to help. But the words that lived easily in the mouths of others felt foreign to him. "I'm sorry. Thank you. It doesn't matter." Simple phrases, yet his tongue felt heavy, trained for deals and arguments, not for gentleness. Jonathan sank into the sofa, the plaid blanket folded neatly at his side. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, staring into the fire, as if the flames might spell out the words he couldn't form. Memories stirred his ex-wife standing in the kitchen years ago, asking him why he always chose silence over kindness. He hadn't known how to answer then, either. Upstairs. Claire sat on the edge of the futon, her knees drawn to her chest, arms wrapped loosely around them. She stared at the slanted ceiling, at the way her breath fogged faintly in the chill air. She wasn't angry, not entirely. She was tired of tiptoeing around his walls, tired of wondering if any gesture she made would ever reach him. And yet, beneath the fatigue, there was something else. A familiar ache she had carried for years. The ache of being near someone and still feeling alone. Downstairs. Jonathan ran a hand across his face. He could hear the faint creak of floorboards above, proof that she hadn't fallen asleep yet. The distance between them was only a few feet, separated by a thin ceiling. but it might as well have been miles. He closed his laptop. Finally, for the first time in years, he had no desire to work. Instead, he sat in silence, listening to the storm outside and the quiet absence inside. The papers could be replaced, the deal could be salvaged. What he wasn't sure he could replace was the trust he felt slipping between them, like sand through fingers. But still, he didn't move. Not yet. The storm did not relent. By late afternoon, snow pressed thick against the windows, blurring the outlines of the pines into shapeless white shadows. The wind howled through the trees with a low, mournful voice, rattling the shutters as if testing the strength of the walls. Inside, the cabin grew darker. Lights flickered once, twice, then went out altogether. The sudden hush was startling. The hum of electricity, so ordinary it usually went unnoticed, vanished. Jonathan looked up from the sofa where he sat staring at his muted laptop screen. Claire, curled on the opposite end with a blanket pulled tight, tilted her head toward the darkened ceiling lamp. "Power's gone," he muttered. His voice sounded louder than he expected. Claire glanced at her phone, tapped the screen, and shook her head. No signal either. Looks like the storm took everything down. Jonathan exhaled through his nose, rubbing his jaw. He hated losing control even to weather, especially to weather. For a while, they both listened to the storm's voice, the cabin creaking with each gust of wind. Jonathan rose and stirred the fire, coaxing the flames higher until the room glowed in soft amber light. Shadows stretched across the walls, flickering, breathing. It wasn't much, but it was something. Claire shifted to the floor near the hearth, wrapping the blanket around her shoulders. She sat cross-legged on the rug, her eyes fixed on the fire, as though it might answer a question she hadn't asked aloud. Jonathan watched her for a moment, then lowered himself into the chair opposite. Without screens, without noise, there was no barrier left, just silence and the presence of another human being too close to ignore. Claire broke it first. Her voice was quiet, but steady. "My mother died when I was 19. Jonathan blinked, surprised by the suddenness of it. He didn't move, afraid any reaction might shut the door she had just cracked open. "It was ovarian cancer," she continued. "She kept it from us for months, said she didn't want to be a burden. By the time we knew, it was already too late." Her gaze stayed fixed on the flames, her words measured but not cold. "She wasn't just my mom. She was everything. The calm in our home, the reason we felt safe, even when money was tight. When she was gone, my father unraveled. He stopped cooking, stopped showing up for work some days. Sometimes he wouldn't get out of bed at all." Jonathan felt a knot tighten in his chest. He had seen men crumble in negotiations, had watched titans of business fall apart under pressure, but this picture she painted of a man undone by grief struck deeper. "I was supposed to go back to school that fall," she said, pulling the blanket closer. "My bags were packed. I had a scholarship, literature, teaching. It was all I wanted." She paused, the fire popping softly in the silence. But he couldn't do it without her. He couldn't even remember to buy groceries. "So I stayed." She spoke it without self-pity, without bitterness, just truth. Jonathan leaned back in his chair, the firelight flickering against his face. He wanted to say something. "I'm sorry. That must have been hard." Or, "You deserved more." But the words stuck. Empathy had never been his language. Deals, strategy, results those he could speak fluently. Comfort, vulnerability. He was a beginner at best. Claire finally turned her head toward him. Her eyes were calm, steady, carrying the weight of someone who had lived through storms long before this one. "You don't have to say anything," she said gently, almost as if she had read his thoughts. "I just wanted you to know." Jonathan swallowed, his throat dry. He realized he had never asked about her past, never wondered what roads had led her into his office 5 years ago. She had always just been there, efficient, composed, reliable. He hadn't considered the cost of such steadiness. The fire crackled again, filling the quiet, Outside, the storm raged with relentless force, but inside the cabin, the silence had shifted. It was no longer the heavy quiet of avoidance, but something else, an invitation, fragile but real. Jonathan rested his elbows on his knees, leaning closer to the fire. "You gave up a lot," he said finally, his voice lower than usual. Claire offered a small, wry smile. "We all do, in one way or another. Or, life doesn't really wait for us to catch up, does it?" He held her gaze for a long moment, the air between them warm with something that wasn't quite comfort, but wasn't distance either. For the first time since arriving at Alpine Ridge, Jonathan felt the walls inside the cabin shifting, not the wooden ones that shielded them from the snow, but the invisible ones he had built around himself. Storms had a way of tearing things down, sometimes roofs, sometimes trees, and sometimes the walls people spent years hiding behind. The fire had settled into a steady rhythm, flames licking gently at the logs, casting long shadows that danced across the pine walls. Outside, the storm still groaned, but in here, something softer had begun to stir. Jonathan sat across from Claire, the chair angled toward the hearth, his hands clasped loosely between his knees. For a long while, he didn't speak. He watched the flames instead, his expression taut with thoughts that seemed to hover just beyond words. Claire didn't push. She sat on the rug near the fire, blanket wrapped around her shoulders, her posture easy but attentive. She had always known when silence was simply silence, and when silence was waiting for something to be said. Tonight felt like the latter. Jonathan exhaled slowly. "My marriage ended 9 years ago." The words hung in the air, heavier than he intended. He hadn't spoken them aloud in months, maybe years. Not because he avoided the truth, but because it felt pointless to name what couldn't be changed. Claire shifted slightly, not closer, not farther, just listening. "I thought I was doing everything right," he continued, his voice low, uneven in a way that surprised him. "I provided, I worked, I made sure she never had to worry about bills or comfort. We had a house by the lake, vacations in Europe, on paper. We looked perfect." His jaw tightened. He pressed his palms together, the firelight reflecting in his eyes. "But somewhere along the way, I forgot that she wasn't a line item on a spreadsheet. I managed her life the way I managed my company, efficiently, predictably, without leaving room for her." Claire's gaze softened. She didn't interrupt. "She fell in love with someone else," he said finally. The words were flat, but beneath them ran an undercurrent of ache. "A man I trusted, my closest friend at the time. We'd built the company together, celebrated every milestone side by side. He knew me better than most, or at least, I thought he did." The fire snapped, punctuating the silence. "She left me a note on the kitchen counter," Jonathan added, his throat tightening. "Said she didn't want to be a project anymore, that she needed to be seen, really seen." I read it 3 times before I felt anything. Not anger, not grief, just emptiness. He paused, leaning back, his shoulders slumping in a way Claire had never seen. For once, the man who filled boardrooms with presence seemed smaller, almost fragile. "I used to think love was about effort," he said quietly. "That if you showed up, provided, stayed loyal, that was enough. But apparently, it wasn't. Not for her. And when she left, I convinced myself it was safer not to try again. Safer to stay behind the walls I knew how to build." Claire's fingers tightened slightly on the edge of the blanket. She recognized the weight in his tone, the resignation of someone who had carried pain alone for too long. "I buried myself in work after that," Jonathan admitted, his voice barely above the crackle of the fire. "It was the only place I felt in control. Deals didn't leave notes on kitchen counters. Numbers didn't walk away." The flames flickered higher, casting his face in sharp relief. His eyes shifted toward Claire, though not fully meeting hers. "I don't know why I'm telling you this. Maybe because it's true," she said softly. Jonathan blinked, her words cutting through the haze. There was no judgment in her voice, no pity, just quiet acknowledgement. For a moment, he let the silence expand again, testing its weight. Then he leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and let the words come without rehearsing them. I don't know how to do this, how to let someone in without fearing they'll just leave. I'm good at contracts, at strategies, at keeping distance. But this, he gestured faintly between them, at the space filled only with firelight. This terrifies me more than any deal I've ever closed. Claire's eyes met his then, steady and calm. She didn't offer comfort, didn't reach across the space. She simply stayed, present and attentive, as if her silence itself was an answer. Jonathan felt something stir in his chest, an ache that wasn't entirely painful. For the first time in years, he had spoken the truth of his loss, not as a line item in his history, but as a wound still tender beneath the armor. And instead of recoiling, Claire simply listened. The fire warmed the room, its glow softening the hard lines of Jonathan's face. For once, he didn't look like the unshakable CEO. He looked like a man who had finally allowed himself to admit he was breakable. And somehow, that felt like the first real step toward healing. By evening, the storm outside had grown almost mesmerizing. Snow swirled in endless spirals across the windows, wind groaning like some ancient voice from the mountains. Inside, Cabin 7. The fire was steady now, casting a warm glow that softened the pine walls and painted their faces in gold. Dinner was nothing more than what the welcome basket offered: crackers, a wedge of Vermont cheddar, a loaf of bread, and a jar of local honey. Claire had found a can of tomato soup in the cupboard and warmed it on the small stovetop. It wasn't much, but she laid it out neatly on the wooden table, arranging it as though it were more than a meal cobbled together in a snowstorm. Jonathan set his laptop aside, surprising himself. He was a man who never missed an opportunity to catch up on emails, but tonight, the idea of typing felt wrong, almost disrespectful to the moment. He joined her at the table, the flickering firelight catching in his dark eyes. Claire lit a small candle she'd found in a drawer. Its flame joined the others, softer than the fire, but somehow more intimate. She hesitated before sitting, as though unsure if this was crossing a line. Jonathan gestured lightly to the chair across from him. They ate quietly at first, the clink of spoons against ceramic bowls the only sound. The soup was warm, simple, familiar, something closer to comfort than either of them expected. It was Jonathan who broke the silence. I don't remember the last time I ate dinner without reading a briefing or answering calls. Claire glanced up, surprised by the almost casual admission. Maybe that's why this tastes better than it should. The corner of his mouth twitched, almost a smile. Maybe, for a moment, they simply looked at each other across the table, candlelight flickering between them. Then Claire let out a quiet laugh, not forced, not rehearsed, just small and genuine. "You've got soup on your tie." Jonathan blinked, glanced down, and saw a faint red spot near the edge of his navy silk tie. For a heartbeat, he looked as though he might scowl. But then, to Claire's surprise, he chuckled. It was a low, rusty sound, as though laughter had grown unused to leaving his chest. The sound startled her more than the storm. She couldn't remember ever hearing him laugh, not like this, not without restraint. And before she knew it, she was laughing too, the kind of laugh that carried more relief than humor. The storm howled, but inside the cabin, something lighter filled the air. When the laughter ebbed, silence returned, but it wasn't the same silence as before. It wasn't heavy with tension or distance. It was gentler now, almost comfortable. Claire lowered her gaze, stirring her spoon slowly through what remained of the soup. Inside, her emotions tumbled in ways she didn't want to name. She had worked beside Jonathan for years, respecting his boundaries, never allowing herself to wonder what lay beyond his walls. But tonight, the walls felt different, thinner. She felt something stirring curiosity, maybe more. And yet, along with it came caution. She knew better than to lean too close, to believe too quickly. She had learned the cost of expecting too much from people. Still, the sound of his laugh lingered in her ears, like a melody she hadn't realized she'd missed. Jonathan leaned back in his chair, studying her in the soft light. For once, he wasn't cataloging details for advantage or measuring words for negotiation. He was simply present. And in that presence, he felt something unfamiliar: peace. He hadn't expected it. In fact, he hadn't expected any of this. But there it was. Undeniable. A quiet meal, a shared laugh, a flickering candle, and the realization that maybe life wasn't only about contracts and acquisitions. Maybe there was something worth noticing in the small, ordinary moments. Claire rose to clear the bowls, moving with her usual grace. Jonathan stood to help, taking the dishes from her hands. Their fingers brushed briefly, and she drew back almost instantly, as if the contact were too much. He didn't comment, but the ghost of a smile tugged at his lips. As they tidied the small kitchen, the storm raged on, but the cabin felt warmer than it had since they arrived. The silence that followed wasn't avoidance this time. It was shared, chosen. Later, Claire settled onto the sofa with her book, though her eyes rarely moved across the page. Jonathan took the chair by the fire, gazing into the flames as if they held answers he didn't yet know how to ask for. For the first time in years, neither of them felt entirely alone. It was fragile, yes, like glass that could shatter with a careless touch. But it was there, a connection, thin but real, glimmering in the firelight. The next morning broke pale and brittle, light filtering weakly through snow-caked windows. The storm had slowed, but left the world blanketed, silent, as though the mountains themselves were holding their breath. Jonathan was already awake, seated at the table with his phone in hand. His shoulders were rigid, his jaw locked. Claire descended the narrow staircase quietly, still wrapped in her cardigan. She paused when she saw him. Something in his posture, the sharp stillness, told her the peace of last night had been shattered. "What happened?" she asked softly. Jonathan didn't look up. His thumb hovered over the screen, eyes narrowed. Finally, he spoke, voice clipped. "We lost the Ridgeway contract." Claire blinked. "Lost?" How he set the phone down with a dull thud. "Someone leaked our offer. Bennett Realty swooped in and closed the deal yesterday." For a moment, Claire didn't move. She thought of the countless hours she had spent preparing those investor packets, drafting presentations, organizing his notes. The project had been their priority for months. Jonathan finally lifted his gaze to her. It was a look she had seen directed at competitors, never at herself, sharp, cold, assessing. There were only 3 people with access to that file. He said, "One is in London this week. The other is me." His words hung in the air, unfinished, but the implication landed like a blade. Claire's chest tightened. "You think it was me?" Jonathan didn't answer. He didn't need to. The silence spoke louder than words. Her hands trembled as she pulled out a chair and sat across from him. "Jonathan, I flagged our cloud storage weeks ago. I told you it wasn't secure enough. I even sent you an alternative encryption method." His eyes flickered, almost imperceptibly, but the steel in his expression didn't waver. Warnings are one thing, proof is another. The words cut clean. Claire swallowed hard, forcing her voice steady. "I've worked beside you for 5 years. I've rearranged my life for your schedule, protected your time, your reputation. Do you really believe I'd throw that away?" Jonathan leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed, the firelight catching in his eyes like shards of glass. "I've learned not to put blind faith in anyone. Not anymore." Her breath caught, sharp as the wind outside. In that moment, the wall she had carefully accepted, the distance she had quietly endured, became unbearable. His suspicion wasn't just about the contract. It was about who he believed she was or wasn't. Claire stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the wooden floor. She turned toward the kitchen, steadying herself against the counter as her vision blurred. She had promised herself long ago that she wouldn't cry over him, over anyone in this world that refused to see her. But the ache was sharp, undeniable. Jonathan rose too, his voice following her. "If you have nothing to hide, then why walk away?" She spun back, eyes shining not with tears, but with something fiercer. "Because your silence hurts more than your words. You didn't even ask me, you just decided for once. Jonathan had no reply. His throat tightened, but the words refused to come. Claire pressed a hand to the back of a chair, grounding herself. Her voice steadied, quiet but firm. When the road's clear, I'm leaving. You won't have to doubt me anymore. The fire crackled sharply in the silence that followed. Jonathan stood frozen, his chest tight with something he couldn't name: anger, fear, regret, maybe all three. Upstairs. The loft waited, her suitcase already half packed. Downstairs. The ruined morning air hung heavy, the kind of heaviness that didn't come from storms outside, but from storms people created within. Jonathan stared at the table, at the phone that had delivered the news, at the shadow of a woman who had always been steady until now. He wanted to say, "Don't go." He wanted to say, "I don't believe it was you." But the reflex to protect himself, to hold on to control, was stronger. And so, he said nothing. The silence between them was no longer fragile. It was broken. The cabin was too still. Jonathan sat at the small wooden table long after Claire had retreated upstairs. His phone lay face down beside the cold coffee mug, its screen black but heavy with accusation. The fire had burned low, filling the room with faint smoke and dim light. He rubbed the bridge of his nose, fatigue pressing hard behind his eyes. Sleep wouldn't come, not with her words still echoing in the air, because your silence hurts more than your words. Eventually, he rose to gather himself, pacing the cabin as though motion might chase away regret. His gaze drifted toward the bench near the entryway, where Claire's scarf lay draped carelessly across her overnight bag. Something small and black peeked out from beneath it. Jonathan hesitated. He reached down and pulled out a leather-bound notebook, its cover worn smooth from years of handling. A thin strap held it shut, the kind of simple, practical detail Claire favored. He turned it over in his hands, debating. This was private, unquestionably. A man who thrived on boundaries knew that better than anyone. And yet, something tugged at him a need, not for control, but for understanding. He loosened the strap and opened the first page. First week on the job. He didn't look at me once during orientation. I don't think he meant it. I think he was already somewhere else in his head. Jonathan blinked. The handwriting was neat, measured, unmistakably hers. He turned another page. 6 months in. He doesn't smile often, but once, when I handed him coffee after a late meeting, he almost did. Almost like he was surprised his face remembered how. A muscle in Jonathan's jaw tightened. He flipped further, each entry small, observational, but never unkind. Year 2. He works like he's afraid to stop, like stillness might swallow him. I wonder what he's lost. He doesn't say, but sometimes I catch him staring out the window longer than usual. Jonathan sat slowly on the edge of the sofa, the notebook resting heavy in his hands. His chest ached as he read on. She had been watching, noticing, recording the pieces of him he had convinced himself were invisible. Year 3. He thanked me today? Not out loud, but in the way he set his pen down when I reminded him to eat lunch. It was small, but it mattered. He doesn't realize how much he gives away when he thinks no one is looking. Jonathan's throat constricted. He had dismissed those moments as nothing reflexes, fragments of politeness. But she had seen them, held on to them, given them meaning he had never intended but somehow always needed. Then came the most recent pages. Colorado trip, cabin smaller than expected. Awkward doesn't begin to cover it. He snapped at me over coffee. I know he wasn't angry at the spill. He was angry at being vulnerable. I don't blame him, but it still stung. Jonathan's hand pressed against his chest, as though he could smooth the ache that spread there. And then, the last entry I tried to leave quietly, I didn't want to make it worse. But part of me hoped he'd stop me, say something, anything. He didn't. I'm not angry, just tired, and still, despite it all. I hope he finds what he's been running from, even if it's not me. Jonathan closed the notebook slowly, as though it might crumble in his hands. He stared into the fire, his reflection flickering in the glass, and felt the weight of years pressing down. She had seen him, all along. She had seen the man behind the armor, behind the silence, behind the endless deals and meetings. She had carried those observations not as weapons, but as quiet truths, tucked away in ink, and he had accused her. Jonathan leaned forward, elbows on his knees, the notebook held against his chest. His breath came shallow, uneven. For a man who prided himself on control, he had never felt so unmoored. The storm outside pressed against the cabin, wind rattling the shutters, snow piling higher, but the real storm was inside regret, sharp and relentless. Jonathan Pierce, the man unshakable in boardrooms, the man who had built empires out of numbers and contracts, sat by the fire with a leather notebook in his hands and realized he had missed the one truth that mattered. Someone had been knocking on his walls for years, and he had never opened the door. By the time the storm broke and the main road reopened, Jonathan was no longer the same man who had walked into cabin 7. The snow outside had begun to soften into slush, the sun breaking weakly through the clouds, but inside him, a storm still raged, a storm of regret, realization, and an urgency he couldn't ignore. Claire was gone. She had left without fanfare, no slammed doors, no dramatic speeches, just a quiet dignity that made her absence louder than any protest could. Jonathan had stood in the cabin that morning, the leather notebook still in his hands, and felt a hollowness he hadn't known was possible. He tried to tell himself to focus. There was a summit waiting for him at the resort investors, CEOs, high-profile names who expected Jonathan Pierce to stride in with confidence, armed with numbers and strategies. His assistant had already messaged twice, asking when he would arrive. But for the first time in his life, Jonathan didn't care. He walked into the resort lobby, the hum of conversation swelling around him. Men in tailored suits gathered near the fireplace. Women in sleek dresses exchanged cards. The sound of power being bartered filled the air. Normally, this was his kingdom, but today, it felt foreign, hollow. His phone buzzed again. The board was waiting. The Ridgeway fallout demanded answers. His presence was essential. Jonathan stared at the screen for a long moment. Then, with a steady hand, he pressed end call. It was the most reckless decision he had made in 20 years, and the most necessary. He turned sharply, ignoring the startled greetings of colleagues, ignoring the whispers that followed. He walked out of the lodge, the cold air biting at his face, and headed for the parking lot. His driver looked up in surprise. "Sir, your schedule, cancel it," Jonathan said firmly. His tone left no room for debate. "Take me back to Denver." Now? The driver hesitated, then nodded. Within minutes, they were on the road, winding down from the mountain toward the city. Snow still clung to the shoulders of the highway, but the main path was clear enough. Jonathan sat in the back seat, staring out the window as pine trees blurred into shadows. For hours, his mind replayed everything: the spill of coffee, the sharpness of his words, the quiet strength in her eyes, the notebook filled with truths he hadn't dared to face. He thought of how she had written, "I hoped he'd stop me, say something, anything," and how he had stayed silent. He had lost deals before. He had lost friends, even his marriage. But losing Claire felt different. It wasn't just loss. It was failure at the deepest level, failure to see, to trust, to reach for something real when it had been right in front of him. By the time they reached Denver, dusk had fallen. The city lights glimmered against the wet pavement, neon signs reflecting in puddles. Jonathan leaned forward. "There's a cafe near the public library," he said. "Corner of 8th and Willow. Take me there." The driver glanced in the mirror. "Now, sir, now." The car weaved through evening traffic, horns blaring, tires hissing against slush. Jonathan's chest tightened with every block. He had no guarantee she would be there. Maybe she had already left for home. Maybe she had decided to disappear entirely from his orbit. But the memory of her voice, steady and calm, kept pulling him forward. The cafe was small, tucked between a used bookstore and a record shop that still displayed vinyl in its window. Warm light spilled onto the sidewalk, fogging the glass with condensation. Jonathan stepped out of the car, his breath forming clouds in the cold air. He pushed open the door, a bell chiming overhead. Inside, the scent of coffee and baked bread wrapped around him. Jazz hummed softly from a speaker, mingling with the quiet clink of mugs and the murmur of evening conversations. And then he saw her. Claire sat in the corner by the window, a wool scarf looped around her neck, her hands curled around a steaming cup of tea. A book lay open on the table before her, but she wasn't reading. She was staring out at the street, her expression thoughtful, distant. For a moment, Jonathan didn't move. He simply watched, his chest tightening at the sight of her, in a world that felt suddenly softer, more human than any boardroom he had ever known. Then, with a steady breath, he crossed the cafe. Claire looked up, her eyes widening in quiet surprise. Jonathan. He stopped at her table, his voice low, stripped of its usual authority. "I've been looking for you." Her gaze held his for a long moment. She closed her book slowly, slipping a receipt between the pages as a marker. Why she asked simply, it was the question that mattered most. Not what he wanted, not what he planned, but why. Jonathan reached into his coat and placed the leather notebook gently on the table between them. "Because I read this, and I finally realized what I've been too blind to see." The cafe around them faded into background noise. For the first time, Jonathan Pierce was not the man of power, not the CEO commanding attention. He was simply a man, one who had finally chosen to leave the kingdom of control behind, if it meant finding the one person who had truly seen him all along. And in that fragile moment, he knew he was done chasing deals. He would chase her instead. The cafe was warm, filled with the gentle hum of low jazz and the scent of fresh bread. Yet between Jonathan and Claire, the air was taut, charged, almost brittle. She sat across from him, hands wrapped around her mug, shoulders drawn slightly inward. He placed the small leather notebook on the table between them, the object that had brought him here, the object that had broken him open. Claire's eyes flickered to it, then back to his face. Her voice, when it came, was soft but sharp, like frost over glass. "Why now? Jonathan, why me?" The question cut deeper than he expected, not because it was cruel, but because it was true. Jonathan exhaled, steadying himself. "Because I finally stopped running from the truth. And when I did, you were the only one standing there." Her brow furrowed, skeptical, wounded. "You've had years, Jonathan. Years where I stood beside you, where I worked late nights, rearranged my life for your schedule. And all that time, you barely looked past your own desk." He leaned forward, his hands resting against the notebook. "I know. I saw the efficiency, the loyalty. But I didn't see you. Not really. I told myself it was safer that way." Claire's lips pressed into a thin line. She looked down at the notebook but didn't touch it. "And now, suddenly, after doubting me, after accusing me of betraying you, you've decided to notice her words carried no bitterness, just exhaustion. The kind born from too many disappointments." Jonathan's chest tightened. "I read what you wrote, every page. You saw things in me I didn't even recognize in myself. And I accused you anyway." His voice dipped, heavy with regret. "I've made a career out of winning, Claire. But in doing that, I've lost the one thing I didn't even know I needed." Claire's fingers traced the rim of her mug slowly, her gaze fixed on the steam rising from her tea. Her silence wasn't indifference, it was deliberation. "You don't get to fix years of silence with one confession," she said finally, her voice steady. "You don't get to decide now that I matter because suddenly you feel alone." Jonathan flinched. He deserved the sting. He slid the notebook closer to her, the leather scraping softly against the table. "I'm not here to fix things with words. I'm here because, for the first time, I know what it means to show up without a contract, without conditions, just me." Claire looked at the notebook, her reflection faint in its dark cover. She remembered writing those words in stolen moments during late nights at the office, between flights, in the quiet hours when Jonathan's walls felt unshakable. She had never intended for him to see them. They were her way of coping, of making sense of the distance she had learned to live with. And now, here he was, using them as a bridge. Her chest ached with conflicting currents, anger at the suspicion that had driven her away, sorrow for the years wasted, and a faint, dangerous warmth at the sincerity in his eyes. Jonathan. Her voice faltered. She steadied it again. I don't know if I can trust this. Trust you. You say you've changed, but how do I know it's not just another storm you'll let pass before you go back to your old ways? Jonathan's gaze didn't waver, because for the first time, I'm willing to risk being wrong. I'm willing to risk losing deals, losing control, losing everything if it means I don't lose you. The cafe noise seemed to recede, leaving only the faint clink of dishes and the slow beat of Claire's heart. She shook her head slightly, a half-smile tinged with pain. You make it sound so simple. It isn't, Jonathan admitted. I'm not asking for forgiveness tonight. I'm asking for a chance to prove that I can be different, that I can be someone who doesn't run when things get difficult, someone who sees you, not just what you do for me. Claire leaned back, her chair creaking softly. She studied him, the sharp lines of his face softened by candlelight, the steadiness in his voice that was different from the boardroom authority she knew so well. This steadiness came from somewhere deeper. Her instinct told her to protect herself, to hold the line she had drawn. But another part of her, the part that remembered his laugh in the cabin, the warmth of his voice by the fire, whispered that maybe he meant it. She reached out, resting her fingertips on the notebook, not taking it back, not rejecting it, just touching it. That little book wasn't meant for you, she said quietly. It was the only place I could put the truth when saying it out loud felt impossible. Jonathan's voice softened. And it's the reason I'm here. Because you wrote what I couldn't face, and I don't want to hide from it anymore. Their eyes held across the small table. Claire's heart wavered, suspended between old wounds and new hope. Jonathan's chest tightened, waiting for the verdict he couldn't control. It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. But it was something. A pause, a possibility. And for Jonathan, that was more than he had dared to hope for. Spring had finally come to Denver. The last patches of snow had melted into the earth, feeding the first shoots of green that pushed bravely through the soil. Trees along the edge of City Park wore a faint mist of buds, their branches trembling with the promise of leaves. The air was cool but gentle, scented faintly with damp earth and the sweetness of blooming narcissus lining the pathways. Jonathan walked slowly along the park's main path, his hands tucked into the pockets of his coat. He was not the man who once strode into boardrooms with the weight of entire deals resting on his shoulders. He walked lighter now, though every step was deliberate, as if he knew the gravity of what he was about to do. Ahead, Claire sat on a wooden bench near the fountain. She wore a pale sweater beneath her trench coat, her hair loose, lifted gently by the breeze. In her hands, a cup of chamomile tea steamed, sending ribbons of warmth into the crisp morning air. She looked peaceful, though her eyes carried the guarded calm of someone still learning whether it was safe to believe. Jonathan stopped for a moment, watching her from a distance. Then, gathering his breath, he approached. Mind if I sit? His voice was softer than it had ever been in the office. Claire looked up, surprised, then gave a quiet nod. Of course. He lowered himself onto the bench beside her. For a long moment, they said nothing. The sound of children playing in the distance, the splash of water in the fountain, the call of sparrows overhead all filled the silence. Finally, Jonathan spoke. I don't have speeches for this, no polished words, no promises I can't keep. He turned slightly toward her, his expression open, unguarded. All I have is the truth. And the truth is I don't want to live behind those walls anymore. Not with you. Claire's fingers tightened slightly around her cup. She studied him, searching for cracks, for the old reflex of control, the familiar armor he always carried. But it wasn't there. His eyes were steady, but not hard. His shoulders, broad and strong, no longer carried the rigid posture of a man trying to prove himself. He continued, voice low, I can't promise perfection. I can't even promise I won't stumble. But I can promise presence, that when it's cold, I'll stay, that when silence feels heavy, I won't run from it, that when you need to be seen, I'll see you. Claire felt a warmth rise in her chest, cautious but undeniable. She wanted to believe him, and yet, years of silence, of distance, had taught her not to lean too quickly into hope. She set her teacup on the bench between them, folding her hands in her lap. Jonathan, do you understand what you're asking for? This isn't about grand gestures or a moment of regret. This is about showing up, every day, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. Jonathan nodded, his gaze steady on hers. I know, and that's why I'm here. Not to dazzle you with promises, but to stand in the open and ask you to believe what you feel, not just what you hear. The breeze lifted, scattering a few petals from the nearby trees. One landed on Claire's lap. She brushed it away gently, her eyes never leaving his. For a long pause, she said nothing, and in that pause, Jonathan felt his chest tighten, as though the entire world balanced on the quiet between them. Finally. Claire spoke. Her voice was calm, but it carried a softness he hadn't heard in a long time. I don't need flowers or poetry. I don't need a perfect story. I need truth. I need someone who won't walk away when it's inconvenient. Someone who stays. Jonathan's breath hitched slightly. That's what I'm offering. She studied him for another moment. And then, slowly, she smiled a small, honest smile. The kind that comes when something heavy finally lifts. All right, she said softly. Let's begin again, not for a fairy tale, for the real thing. Jonathan exhaled, relief washing through him. He reached out, not rushing, but offering. Claire hesitated only a heartbeat before placing her hand in his. Their fingers intertwined, warm against the cool spring air. Around them, the park continued as usual, children laughing, dogs barking, joggers passing by. No one else noticed the quiet shift happening on that bench. But for Jonathan and Claire, it was everything. It wasn't a grand finale. It wasn't fireworks or declarations. It was something quieter, something stronger, a new beginning, built not on illusion, but on truth. A year had passed since that morning in the park. The seasons had turned their circle: summer with its heat, autumn with its golden leaves, winter with its silence, and now spring had returned again, carrying with it a new kind of hope. Jonathan stood at the edge of the clearing in Colorado, his boots sinking slightly into the damp ground. Before him stood Cabin 7, the very place where his life had cracked open. Its roof was freshly mended, the porch railings straightened, the old pine walls polished until they glowed with honey-colored warmth. Smoke curled gently from the chimney, not as a symbol of isolation anymore, but of welcome. Claire stepped out onto the porch, her hair catching the sunlight, a clipboard in her hands. She wore jeans and a sweater flecked with sawdust, evidence of hours spent alongside the contractors and volunteers. She waved when she saw him, her smile soft but sure. Looks different, doesn't it? She called. Jonathan walked toward her, his eyes roaming the structure that had once felt like a prison of silence. Now it looked like something else entirely. It does, he said, his voice carrying quiet wonder. It looks alive. Over the past year, they had poured themselves into the project, using Jonathan's resources and Claire's vision to transform the cabin and eventually others like it into places of rest for those carrying grief. Families who had lost loved ones, single parents struggling after heartbreak, children navigating foster care. Instead of chasing profit, they were creating sanctuaries. Inside, the cabin smelled of fresh paint and cedar. The loft had been insulated and lined with shelves now filled with donated books and journals. The kitchen, once cramped, had been opened up with new counters. A large wooden table sat in the center, meant for shared meals and conversations that mattered. On the mantel above the fireplace, a simple plaque read, "Hope lives here." Jonathan ran his hand along the smooth edge of the table. He remembered the arguments he had once waged in boardrooms, the endless negotiations that had defined his days. But here, there was no need for contracts. No one asked for profit margins or forecasts. Here, the measure of success was a child's laughter, a widow's sigh of relief, the quiet way people softened when they realized they weren't alone. Claire joined him, setting the clipboard aside. She brushed sawdust from her sweater, her eyes shining. The first family arrives next week, a father and his teenage daughter. They lost their wife and mother last fall. Jonathan nodded slowly, his chest tightening not from sorrow, but from a strange, new kind of fulfillment. Then this place is ready. Claire studied him for a moment, noticing the changes she had watched unfold over the past year. He still carried himself with the steadiness of a leader, but the edge of constant control had softened. His eyes lingered on people now, not just projects. His laughter came more easily. He was no longer the man who measured value only in numbers. "You know," she said softly, "I think you're happier here than you ever were in the city." Jonathan chuckled, his gaze drifting toward the fire crackling in the hearth. "For years, I thought joy came from building higher, moving faster, winning bigger. Turns out, it feels a lot more like this." He gestured around the cabin, helping someone else stand when they don't think they can. Claire slipped her hand into his, their fingers fitting together with the quiet ease of a partnership, tested and earned. "That's what you were always meant for, Jonathan. You just needed to find the right foundation." They stepped outside again, the air crisp and filled with the scent of pine. Volunteers were finishing the landscaping, planting daffodils along the walkway, flowers that would bloom each spring as a symbol of resilience. Jonathan watched them work, his heart swelling with something he hadn't felt in years: purpose. The mountains rose high around them, still capped with snow, eternal and unshaken. And yet, Jonathan felt no urge to conquer them. For once, he was content simply to stand in their shadow, to know that strength wasn't always about climbing higher. It was about carrying others when the climb became too much. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the ridges and painted the sky in shades of gold and violet, Jonathan and Claire sat side by side on the porch of the cabin. The air was cool, the world quiet, except for the distant sound of wind in the trees. Jonathan turned to her, his voice low. "I used to think legacy meant towers with my name on them. But now," he looked back at the cabin, its windows glowing warmly against the twilight. "Now, I think it means this. Something that lasts because it heals." Claire rested her head lightly against his shoulder. "Then you found it." And for the first time in his life, Jonathan Pierce believed her. The cabin had settled into a new rhythm, no longer a place of storms and silences. It had become a living home, warmth layered into every corner, laughter occasionally echoing off the pine walls, the faint scent of bread or soup often drifting from the kitchen. That evening, Jonathan stood at the counter, sleeves rolled up, chopping carrots with a precision that made Claire laugh. "You don't have to slice them like you're negotiating a contract," she teased, her eyes glinting as she stirred a pot on the stove. He smirked. "Old habits die hard. Besides, precision's important. Not when you're making stew," she countered, nudging his shoulder gently as she passed. The simple exchange carried more warmth than any candlelit dinner he'd ever attended. It wasn't about elegance or appearances. It was about presence, two people moving in rhythm, their steps easy, their laughter unforced. When the stew was ready, they sat at the wooden table Jonathan had once admired for its sturdy craftsmanship. The fire flickered in the hearth, casting soft shadows across the walls. Outside, the evening air was cool, stars beginning to scatter across the sky. They ate slowly, talking about the small things, how the daffodils were finally blooming along the porch, how one of the volunteer carpenters had left behind a hammer and promised to come back for it, how Claire had discovered a new pie recipe she wanted to try. Ordinary things, the kind that weave themselves into memory not because they are grand, but because they are shared. After dinner, Jonathan insisted on washing the dishes while Claire dried them. She watched him at the sink, sleeves damp, hair slightly mussed, and felt a quiet swell of affection. Years ago, she never would have imagined this version of him, the man who once measured time in contracts, now content to measure it in small acts of care. When the kitchen was tidy again, they settled on the sofa near the fire. Claire tucked her legs beneath her, leaning into the warmth of the blanket draped across them. Jonathan rested an arm along the back of the sofa. His body relaxed in a way she rarely saw. For a while, they simply sat in the quiet, the fire snapping softly. Then Claire shifted, her hand slipping gently into his. "There's something I need to tell you," she said, her voice soft but steady. Jonathan turned, his brow furrowing slightly. "What is it?" She hesitated, her eyes flickering to the fire before meeting his. "I'm pregnant." The words landed gently, but their weight was immense. For a moment, Jonathan didn't move. His breath caught, his chest tightening with an emotion he hadn't felt in years, something raw, overwhelming, almost terrifying in its beauty. "Are you sure?" His voice was hushed, reverent. Claire nodded, her eyes gleaming. 11 weeks. Jonathan blinked rapidly, as if trying to anchor himself in the reality of it. He leaned forward, pressing his forehead to hers, his hand covering hers against her stomach. For the first time in decades, he felt fragile and yet more alive than ever. "I don't..." His voice broke slightly. He cleared his throat, tried again. "I don't have words for this." "You don't need to," Claire whispered. "Just be here." Jonathan closed his eyes, his breath shaky. He had built towers of steel and glass, amassed fortunes, commanded rooms of powerful men and women, but nothing, not a single achievement had ever made him feel the way this moment did. The idea of a child, a family, something not built on contracts or expectations, but on life itself. When he finally spoke, his words were thick with emotion. "I never thought I'd have this again. A family, a chance to do it right this time." Claire's hand tightened around his. "You will. We will." The fire glowed brighter, as though echoing the warmth that filled the room. Outside, the stars shone steadily over the mountains, silent witnesses to a moment that would change everything. Jonathan sat back, still holding her hand against her stomach, as though afraid to let go. For the first time in his life, he wasn't thinking about tomorrow's plans or next quarter's numbers. He was thinking about lullabies, about laughter echoing through these walls, about the fragile, miraculous seed of new life. And in that realization, Jonathan Pierce, once the man who defined himself by power and profit, felt something he had never truly known before: home. 3 years had passed, yet the cabin still stood as steadfast as the mountains around it. What once was a place of awkward silence and buried pain had become something larger than Jonathan or Claire had ever imagined. The cabin was no longer just a retreat. It was a sanctuary, a center of healing whispered about in quiet circles, recommended by word of mouth rather than glossy brochures. Travelers came not for luxury, but for rest. Widows found space to grieve without judgment. Veterans who carried invisible wounds sat by the fire and, for the first time in years, let their shoulders relax. Children navigating the uncertainties of foster care discovered shelves filled with storybooks, journals waiting for their words, and volunteers who listened. Jonathan never advertised it. He didn't need to. The place carried its own reputation, the kind built on stories shared over tea, on lives gently shifted, on hope restored where none had been before. Inside, the cabin glowed with the signs of a lived-in home. The stone fireplace crackled warmly, its mantel decorated with drawings left behind by children who had stayed there. Wooden beams overhead bore tiny etchings of initials from families who wanted to leave a mark. Not as graffiti, but as a testament. We were here. We healed here. On this particular evening, laughter filled the room, light, high-pitched, and unrestrained. Little Lily Pierce, barely 3 years old, darted across the living room in mismatched socks, her curls bouncing as she clutched a stuffed rabbit nearly as big as herself. "Daddy! Catch me!" she squealed, her voice ringing out like bells. Jonathan gave chase, moving slower than he could have, deliberately letting her stay just out of reach. His once imposing frame bent low, his arms outstretched, a grin tugging at his face. Gone was the man of cold authority. In his place was a father, playful, patient, radiant in the joy of a child's laughter. Claire leaned against the doorframe of the kitchen, watching them with a soft smile. Her apron bore a smear of flour, the scent of fresh bread drifting into the room. She had grown accustomed to these scenes, Jonathan on the floor building block towers, Jonathan carrying Lily on his shoulders as they walked the trail, Jonathan reading bedtime stories with a voice far gentler than the one he once used to negotiate contracts. He scooped Lily into his arms at last, lifting her high into the air. She squealed with delight, her laughter echoing against the pine walls. Jonathan held her close, pressing a kiss to her cheek before lowering her carefully to the rug by the fire. "Story time," Lily asked, her eyes wide with expectation. Jonathan glanced toward Claire, who chuckled and set aside the bread dough. "All right," she said, wiping her hands. One story before bed. They gathered on the sofa, Lily nestled between them, her stuffed rabbit clutched tightly. Jonathan opened one of the worn children's books from the shelf. His voice was steady, calm, weaving the tale while Lily's eyelids grew heavier with each page. By the time he closed the book, she was asleep, her head resting against his chest. Jonathan looked down at her, his heart swelling in ways he never thought possible. For years, he had lived for numbers, for victories that looked impressive on paper but left him hollow. Now, this small, simple weight of a child sleeping against him felt like the greatest triumph of all. Claire touched his arm gently. "She's got your eyes," she whispered. Jonathan smiled faintly, brushing a curl from Lily's forehead. "And your stubborn streak," he replied. They sat in silence for a while, the fire snapping softly, their daughters breathing steady between them. Outside, snow dusted the mountains, but inside, warmth radiated through every corner. Later, when Lily was tucked into her small bed upstairs, Jonathan and Claire returned to the porch. They sat wrapped in blankets, sipping warm cider as the night settled around them. The stars spread wide above, brilliant against the dark sky. Jonathan spoke quietly, almost to himself. "I used to think success meant standing at the top of the world alone, but now..." He gestured toward the cabin, the laughter still echoing faintly in his mind. "Now I think success is this. Not the buildings, not the money, just this." Claire leaned her head against his shoulder, her breath warm in the cool night. "And you built it," she said softly. "Not just the cabin. This life." Jonathan shook his head. "We built it. You showed me where to start." They sat that way for a long time, their hands intertwined, the mountains silent witnesses to their peace. Inside, Lily stirred in her sleep, mumbling something incoherent, then settling again. Her presence filled the cabin with a kind of light that no storm could extinguish. For Jonathan Pierce, who had once been defined by walls of glass and steel, this was the life he hadn't dared to imagine: a family, a home, a legacy not of empires, but of love. The winter had returned to the mountains, soft and quiet. Snow fell in gentle spirals, drifting onto the porch of Cabin 7, blanketing the pines that stood tall against the cold. Inside, the fire glowed bright, filling the air with warmth, laughter, and the smell of cinnamon tea. It had been another long day. A family of 3, a father and his teenage daughters, were staying at the cabin this week. They had lost their wife and mother only months before, and their grief was still raw. The younger girl had found comfort in sketching by the fire. The older had spent the day hiking the trails in silence, her father trailing behind with the kind of heaviness that only comes from trying to carry too much alone. Now, as evening settled, the guests gathered near the fire. Jonathan sat on the rug, Lily curled against him with her crayons scattered across the floor. Claire moved between the kitchen and the living room, making sure everyone had what they needed: a refill of tea, an extra blanket, a gentle word spoken at just the right time. Later, after the girls had gone to bed and the father sat quietly reading in the loft, Claire carried the teapot back to the counter. She felt the stillness in the room, a stillness that wasn't empty, but peaceful. One of the guests, a woman staying in a nearby cabin, lingered by the fire. She had come to help, offering meals and companionship to families in pain. She watched Jonathan tucking Lily into his lap, her small head resting trustfully against his chest. Then she turned to Claire, her expression thoughtful. "Can I ask you something?" the woman said softly. Claire smiled. "Of course." The woman hesitated, her gaze flicking to Jonathan and back. How did you know? Claire tilted her head. Know what? That he was the one. After everything, after the storms. For a moment, Claire was quiet. Her eyes softened as memories passed through her mind. The snow pounding against the windows of this very cabin years ago. The silence that had once felt unbearable. The sharp words that had stung. The confessions whispered in the glow of the fire. She remembered the ache of mistrust, the decision to walk away, and the man who had followed not to claim her, but to see her. Her gaze lingered on Jonathan, who now looked up and caught her eyes with a small smile. Lily had fallen asleep in his arms, her tiny fingers clutching the collar of his sweater. Claire turned back to the woman. Her voice was low, steady, carrying the weight of lived truth. "Because he didn't just stay when the storm came," she said. "He stayed until it passed." The woman's eyes glistened, and she nodded, understanding more than words alone could convey. Claire crossed the room and sat beside Jonathan, brushing a strand of hair from Lily's forehead. He leaned slightly toward her, their shoulders touching, the unspoken bond between them stronger than any vow. Outside, snow continued to fall, soft and relentless, covering the scars of the earth in white. The cabin glowed from within, its light spilling into the night like a beacon, a promise that even in the harshest seasons, warmth and love could survive. Years ago, Jonathan Pierce had been a man defined by walls, by deals and numbers and a life of distance. Claire Donovan had been a woman who carried silence like armor, who learned to give without asking for a place to belong. Together, in this cabin, they had been stripped of their defenses. Together, they had chosen to stay. Now, the storm was only a memory, and what remained was stronger than either of them had imagined. The snow fell, the fire burned, and inside Cabin 7, love endured, not perfect, not effortless, but real. Life rarely gives us warnings before the storms arrive. Sometimes they come as blizzards in the mountains, other times as betrayals, losses, or the quiet ache of loneliness. What Jonathan and Claire discovered is what many of us forget. Storms don't just test us, they reveal us. They strip away titles, routines, and defenses until all that remains is the truth of who we are and who is willing to stay by our side. The greatest lesson is simple, but not easy. Love is not about grand gestures or perfect promises. It is about presence. It is about choosing to stay, even when it is uncomfortable, even when the silence feels heavy, even when trust must be rebuilt brick by brick. For those of us who have lived long enough to know the weight of regret, the story reminds us that it is never too late to open the door again, to forgive, to allow someone in, to believe that the storm will pass and that what remains can be even stronger than what was lost. Perhaps real strength isn't in what we build outside, but in what we nurture inside: patience, truth, and the courage to stay. Thank you so much for spending your precious time with this story. If it touched your heart, even in a small way, please give it a like. Share it with someone who might need hope today. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Every click, every comment, every share helps us keep bringing you stories that matter. Until next time, take care and never stop believing in second chances.